This is the Disturbing Ancient Mysteries Iceberg. Tier 1. The Rohonc Codex. Imagine you're cataloging a donated library in the 1800s when you come across a volume that looks perfectly normal. You open it, and the text makes no sense at all. This puzzling little book is the Rohonc Codex. It appeared in the 1800s in Hungary when a nobleman named Gustav Batthyány donated his entire library to the Hungarian Academy of Scientists. Experts first assumed it was a medieval relic written in some ancient Hungarian script, but that idea didn't last. The more they studied it, the stranger it became. The codex contains 448 pages written from right to left, filled with a mix of straight and curved symbols. But here's the odd part, there are way too many of them. It uses about 10 times more symbols than any known alphabet, and most of them barely repeat. That suggests it might not even be a proper writing system. And it's not just text. The book contains 87 drawings showing landscapes, battle scenes, and religious imagery. What makes that even more confusing is that these drawings include symbols from Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam. So whoever wrote the codex either lived in a very multicultural place or just really liked mixing religions. Then there's the matter of time. Every page carries a watermark that dates between 1529 and 1540 AD. But many historians believe the contents were written long before that. It's like finding a medieval diary printed on modern office paper. Something doesn't add up. Since its discovery, countless researchers have tried and failed to decode it. One scholar even thought it might have been written from bottom to top and gave translation a shot that way. Her work was later torn apart by critics who said she was imagining things. Some Hungarian historians believe the whole thing might just be an elaborate prank pulled off in the 18th century by a known forger named Samuel Literary Nemes. He had a history of faking historical documents, so naturally, he became everyone's favorite suspect. The problem is, no one's ever found proof linking him to the codex. But what if it's not a prank? What if it actually contains real information written in a system that doesn't match anything we know? The writing won't sit neatly in any category. It doesn't behave like a normal language, a standard cipher, or random nonsense. That strange middle ground is what keeps linguists, cryptographers, and historians from letting it go. The Shroud of Turin. You're a 14th century Christian standing in a small church in France as a long linen cloth is lifted into view. At first, it just looks old and stained. Then you notice the outline of a man. He's naked and marked with injuries that feel uncomfortably familiar if you know the crucifixion story. That cloth is the Shroud of Turin. It's one of those relics that makes historians groan and believers swoon at the same time. The shroud is about 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, with the faint image of a crucified man burned into the fabric. He's tall, muscular, bearded, with shoulder-length hair parted down the middle. Based on the proportions, experts estimate he'd stand somewhere between 5'7" and 6'2". You're probably thinking, well, it's just a coincidence. Fair enough, but this is only the beginning. The man on the shroud is covered in wounds that line up suspiciously well with the crucifixion story. There are thorn marks on his head, cuts on his back, bruises on his shoulders, and stains that some studies have identified as real blood. The first time anyone actually noticed the shroud was in the 1350s in Liqian, France. Some knight named Geoffroy de Charnay had it, and nobody had a clue where it came from, who made it, or why it existed. Naturally, they put it on display in a church, and the bishops immediately called foul play. They figured some scheming clergyman whipped it up as a way to fill the church coffers. By 1578, the shroud had already been through some fire and water damage, and it eventually made its way to Turin, Italy. Today, it's only displayed on rare occasions, and many Christians treat it as the real burial cloth of Jesus. According to legend, Jesus' body was wrapped in linen before being placed in the tomb, and the shroud supposedly appeared after his resurrection. If you believe in miracles, the story definitely checks out. But as always, science showed up right on time to ruin everything. Carbon dating places the cloth between 1260 and 1390 AD, meaning it's far too new to have wrapped a first century corpse. That effectively killed the claim that it's Jesus' burial shroud. But it didn't answer the main question. How did the faint, photographic style image get onto the fabric in the first place? The image isn't made with paint or dye. It only affects the very top fibers of the cloth, and it behaves more like a negative than a drawing. So even after the religious claim was ruled out, the shroud remained a scientific curiosity because no known medieval technique can fully explain it. Italy's National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development spent years trying to replicate the chemical and physical properties of the shroud, but they couldn't. They tried everything from chemicals to lasers, but nothing worked. That hasn't stopped people from coming up with theories, though. In 2002, Raymond Rogers from the Los Alamos suggested the image could have formed from a chemical reaction between a real body and the cloth. A few years later, in 2014, one paper floated the idea that radiation from an earthquake might have burned the image onto the fabric. The bloodstains have their own mysteries too. Tests done in 2015 by the Spanish Center of Syndenology found their AB type. And then there's the wild idea that the shroud is an early kind of photography, since the image behaves like a negative. None of these theories fully solves the puzzle, but each one gives the shroud just enough wiggle room to keep scientists and believers arguing. The Great Sphinx. According to legend, a winged creature once appeared in the ancient city of Thebes as punishment for some forgotten crime. She terrorized the people with a riddle, devouring anyone who answered incorrectly, until a man named Oedipus finally got it right and the creature killed herself. That creature was called a sphinx. But of course, it was just a myth. Yet long before Greek storytellers spun their tales, Egypt had its own sphinx, a real massive monument that has puzzled people for thousands of years. The Great Sphinx of Giza. The Sphinx is a massive block of limestone stretching about 240 feet long and 66 feet tall. It was carved out of one single piece of stone, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. Archaeologists estimate it took around 100 workers 3 years to finish. That's a long time to spend on a group project. Most experts agree it was built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu or his son Khafre around 2500 BCE. But the face? That's still a mystery. Some say it's Khufu himself. Others say it's Khafre or even another son, Djedefre. Some theories suggest that one pharaoh built the Great Sphinx as a tribute to another, which sounds plausible until you remember that ancient Egyptian rulers weren't exactly famous for family harmony. Whatever its original purpose was, the monument has taken a serious beating over the centuries. Wind, sand, water, and time have all chewed away at it, leaving the surface pitted and worn. Some researchers even point to unusual patterns of erosion that suggest heavy rainfall may have contributed, a theory that, if true, could indicate the Sphinx endured much wetter conditions than present-day Egypt. It is a lot older than we think. All of that is pretty fascinating. But for most people, nothing draws the eye quite like the Sphinx's famously missing nose. For a long time, people blamed Napoleon's troops for shooting it off, though there are sketches from centuries earlier that already show it noseless. So unless Napoleon was secretly a time traveler, that one's off the table. A more likely story points to a man named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar, a Sufi Muslim from the 14th century who, according to some accounts, smashed the nose after seeing locals treat the statue like an idol. He was arrested for it though, so if this version's true, at least we know someone paid the price for wrecking a national monument. Of course, there's also the theory that someone hacked the thing off just to sell it. That sounds exactly like something humans would do. The problem is that it would have required removing a huge chunk of carved stone from the Sphinx and somehow carrying it away without leaving any clear record of when or how it happened. Even after centuries of study, the Sphinx still sparks debate. Historians argue over who carved it, whose face it bears, and whether it was meant as a tomb marker, a guardian, or a statement of divine power. The evidence is slim, and every theory depends on interpretation. That's what keeps the Great Sphinx at the center of Egyptology discussions, centuries after it was first carved. Wondering about ancient creatures is fun. Collecting and commanding hundreds of them is better. Which brings me to today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid is a free-to-play fantasy RPG where you collect and battle hundreds of champions across the massive world of Teleria. And right now is a great time to start. Raid is celebrating its 7th anniversary. And over 7 years, the game has grown massively. New champions, new game modes, and loads more. As part of the anniversary, new players who download using my link get a starter pack worth over $200, including legendary champion Krok'mar the Devourer. Enter promo code RAID7 within 48 hours, and you'll also unlock Pelops the Victor, a free brand new legendary from the newest faction, the Argonites. He's a hybrid tank with magma shield, taunt, and HP burn, so enemies target him while catching fire. Keep leveling up and you'll earn even more. An epic skill tome at 10, silver and energy along the way, and an epic champion called Galapo the Recluse at level 25. And everyone, new or returning, gets Ezio from Assassin's Creed free by logging in 7 days. Raid is available on PC, iOS, and Android with cross-platform play and cross-progression. Scan the QR code or click the link below to download and claim those anniversary rewards. Now, back to the video. The mystery of Cleopatra's tomb. Cleopatra ruled Egypt, outplayed Roman generals, and turned herself into a political symbol so powerful that Rome spent decades trying to erase her. And then she died, and her tomb vanished. Ancient writers like Plutarch say Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together in a grand mausoleum near a temple of Isis in Alexandria. And that's all the detail they gave. Sounds straightforward enough, until you remember that large parts of ancient Alexandria no longer exist where they're supposed to. Earthquakes, rising sea levels, and tsunamis pushed whole neighborhoods into the Mediterranean. Once you factor in what happened to Alexandria itself, it's easy to see why finding the missing tomb is one of the ancient world's biggest mysteries. For over 20 years, Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has argued that Cleopatra's tomb isn't in Alexandria at all, but at Taposiris Magna, a major Isis temple complex about 30 miles west of the city. The logic behind her argument is rooted in politics. After Cleopatra's defeat, Alexandria became Rome's trophy city, and a burial there would have left her legacy in the hands of her conquerors. Choosing Taposiris Magna, a temple linked to Isis and Osiris that was safely outside Alexandria, would have been the perfect way for her to preserve her image as a divine ruler beyond Roman control. Martinez's team has uncovered coins stamped with Cleopatra's face, statues of Isis, and mummies wearing gold tongue amulets meant to help the dead speak in the afterlife, around the temple complex at Taposiris Magna. They've also discovered a massive tunnel carved straight through the temple's bedrock, stretching over a kilometer. Part of the site now sit underwater, likely a result of the same seismic activity that destroyed Alexandria's royal quarter. If Cleopatra's tomb is here, it could very well be buried beneath centuries of collapsed stone and sediment. But not everyone buys this theory. Many historians argue Cleopatra was almost certainly buried in Alexandria's royal district, close to her palace, exactly where Roman sources imply. Depending on the exact spot, her tomb could be underwater, beneath the modern city, or a combination of the both, making it nearly impossible to reach. It might be hidden under an apartment building, a road, or the harbor floor. If it's underwater, then underwater archaeology is the only way forward. And that's where things get ugly. Visibility is terrible, ruins are unstable, and every tool has to be hauled down and back up. Divers deal with decompression limits, collapsing structures, and the fact that one bad move can get someone killed. Entire seasons of work can end with nothing more than mapped stone and broken walls. Cleopatra's tomb is the last physical statement she ever made. Rome spent centuries framing her as a dangerous seductress to make conquest look justified, while Cleopatra spent her life presenting herself as a legitimate ruler with divine backing. Wherever she was buried, especially if she had a say in the matter, it was likely a political move to shape how her story would be remembered. Sadly, we may never know what that choice was. The Piri Reis Map. In 1929, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was digging through old papers in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul when he stumbled on something that would confuse historians for the next 100 years. Among a pile of forgotten junk, he found what looked like a scrap of gazelle skin covered in strange drawings. That scrap turned out to be the Piri Reis Map. At first glance, it's just an old map, but a closer look showed it was drawn in 1513 AD by a Turkish admiral and cartographer named Muhyiddin Piri, better known as Piri Reis. He claimed he'd pieced it together using 20 older charts and maps, including some made by Christopher Columbus. The map shows parts of Europe, Africa, and South America with shocking accuracy for something made over 500 years ago. But that isn't why it became famous. What really caught everyone's attention was a mysterious landmass drawn at the bottom. Some say it looks suspiciously like Antarctica. But if that land really is Antarctica, then that means Reis somehow mapped it about 3 centuries before anyone officially discovered it. Even stranger, his version shows it without ice, something Earth hasn't seen in at least 6,000 years. Since Antarctica wasn't discovered until the 1800s, Reis's accuracy has led to some wild theories. One claims he used ancient maps made by a lost high-tech society. Another jumps straight to aliens mapping the Earth from space. Of course, historians aren't buying any of that. The simplest explanation is that Reis or his sources were estimating, filling in unknown regions with educated guesses. Some details might have been copied from earlier maps inaccurately or added later, and that Antarctica could easily be the southern tip of Southern America, misaligned or exaggerated after multiple copies and redrawings. Even so, the Piri Reis map keeps coming up in debates because for something that was created in 1513, It's unusually detailed. Tier 2. Baalbek Stones. If you've ever end up in Lebanon, you might visit a quiet town called Baalbek, a place that looks like someone started building a Roman city and quit halfway. Today, it's mostly broken stone, scattered columns, and half-collapsed temples, but the Temple of Jupiter still dominates the site. The Romans built it in the 2nd century to honor Jupiter, their king of gods. But the real stars of the show are the stones underneath it. They're called the Baalbek stones, and they've been making historians sweat for centuries. Each one of them is about the size of a small apartment block, and together, they've been holding up the entire temple since it first went up. 3 of them, called the Trilithon, measure around 19 meters long and 3.6 meters thick, each weighing close to 800 tons. Somehow, people 2,000 years ago lifted these things 20 feet into the air and placed them into the foundations of the complex with laser-like precision. Except lasers weren't even a thing back then. The most famous block around here is the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. It sits about 900 meters away, weighing roughly 1,000 tons. And for reasons no one can explain, it was just abandoned there. Naturally, the locals tried to make sense of the whole thing by filling in the blanks with stories. One says a pregnant woman knew the secret to moving the stones but never shared it. Another claims pregnant jinn were involved. There's even a belief that touching the Stone of the Pregnant Woman can make women fertile. All fun, but not exactly helpful if you're trying to understand Roman engineering. The stones at Baalbek raise bigger questions than their size alone, especially about how they were moved and why. The limestone blocks of the Trilithon come from a quarry about 800 meters away, slightly higher than the temple site. Archaeologists suggest the stones might have been rolled on logs and moved using capstans and pulleys, with hundreds of men working in coordination. Sure, it sounds plausible, but even with the technology we have now, shifting stones that heavy would still be a massive challenge. The scale of the stones matches the ambitions of the site. The Roman Temple of Jupiter was the largest of its kind, with 54 pillars nearly 20 meters high and a roof apex estimated at 44 meters. The massive slabs underfoot were necessary to support all that weight, yet some enormous stones were left half-carved in the quarry. Why they were abandoned, how the others were moved, and who designed the foundations remains unknown. On top of that, the origins of the foundation are debated. While the Romans built the visible structures, some evidence suggests the massive base may predate them, possibly Phoenician. That leaves open the idea that the Romans were not the original builders. They may have just been later occupants who added their temples on top of a foundation someone else had already constructed. For engineers and historians, Baalbek is a puzzle of unknown transport methods, precision engineering, contested origins, and abandoned monoliths. Were the builders using lost techniques, brute strength, or just extraordinary patience and coordination? The debate is far from settled. Rujm el-Hiri. You're walking across a windy plateau in the Golden Heights, kicking loose stones and quietly wondering why anyone dragged you all the way out here to look at what seems like a random pile of rocks. From ground level, it's underwhelming. Low stone walls, broken circles. Nothing that screams ancient mystery or even mild importance. It just looks messy and old. Then, someone shows you an aerial photo and suddenly it all makes sense. You're looking at 5 giant concentric rings made of 40,000 tons of basalt stretched across the plateau, with a mound in the center shaped like a bullseye. Built sometime between 3000 and 2700 BCE, it's roughly the same age as Stonehenge. The difference is that Stonehenge came with burials, tools, and cultural clues. This place did not. Its Arabic name means stone heap of the wildcat, while the Hebrew name translates to Wheel of Giants. Early visitors leaned into the giant idea, but archaeology points to something less dramatic and more exhausting. Building this site would have taken over 25,000 working days, all spent hauling volcanic rock without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. At the center of the formation sits a mound about 15 feet high, built from smaller stones stacked inward. It is often labeled a tomb, mostly because people expect something that size to hold a body, but no human remains have ever been found. A few small items turned up during dig, including jewelry fragments and a metal pin, though they appear to come from much later activity rather than the original builders. Whatever this mound was for, it was not meant to leave a clear trail behind. The surrounding rings slope gently outward, uneven in height, but carefully laid out, each one thinner than the last. At one point, researchers thought the northeast gate might line up with the summer solstice sunrise, which would have given the site a clear ritual or calendar role. That idea fell apart after a 2024 study showed the plateau itself has shifted over thousands of years. Any alignment seen today would be accidental, not intentional. Beyond that, explanations started to thin out. Suggestions ranged from a ritual center to a burial complex to a place where bodies were exposed to animals. But none of these ideas line up cleanly with the evidence. There are no carvings, no inscriptions, no tools, and no bones. The builders invested tens of thousands of workdays moving basalt by hand, yet left behind almost nothing that explains who they were or why this mattered to them. The site reflects planning, coordination, and long-term commitment on a massive scale, but it offers almost no cultural signals in return. It has been surveyed from the ground, mapped from the air, and studied with modern scanning tools, and still it refuses to settle into any familiar category. All that effort went into something clearly important to its builders, and whatever that importance was, it vanished with them. The Hypogeum of Ħal-Saflieni. Back in 1902, a stonemason was laying foundations for new houses in Paula when his tools suddenly broke through a stone roof. At first, he assumed it was a collapsed cistern or a storage pit, the kind you find all over Malta. But when archaeologists were called in, it became clear this was no ordinary underground space. The structure turned out to be the Hypogeum of Ħal-Saflieni, a 3-level complex carved entirely out of bedrock, sitting directly beneath what is now a residential neighborhood. It was dug sometime between 3600 and 2500 BCE using stone and antler tools. The upper level sits just below the surface, and likely mirrors earlier above-ground spaces, with wide chambers that were probably used for initial burials. The middle level is more carefully finished, with curved walls, carved doorways, and columns that closely resemble Malta's megalithic temples. The lowest level lies around 10 meters down and consists of small, enclosed chambers with no clear signs of everyday use. Inside the Hypogeum, archaeologists found pottery, beads, amulets, animal bones, and the remains of roughly 7,000 people. That number alone tells you this wasn't just a one-off burial site. The most famous object found here is the small clay figure known as the Sleeping Lady. She's lying on her side, calm and heavy-set, looking completely at ease in a place that once held thousands of bodies. Whether she represents fertility, death, or something else entirely is still up for debate. The site seems to have changed purpose over time. It likely started as a ceremonial space and slowly became a place for the dead, though there's no clear line when that shift happens. One chamber, often called the Oracle Room, has unusual acoustics. Even a low voice echoes through the structure. Modern tests show the space naturally amplifies certain low frequencies, which means the builders understood how sound behaved in that room. What they used it for, though, is another question. There's no evidence tying it to any wider ritual tradition beyond the island itself. Early excavations also reported skulls with stretched shapes, which kicked off all kinds of theories about strange rituals. Later studies showed those claims were overstated or caused by damage after burial. But by then, the stories had already taken on a life of their own. Generations of people carved it by hand, buried thousands of dead there, and left behind objects that clearly mattered to them. But they didn't leave symbols, inscriptions, or anything that clearly spells out what this place was supposed to be. We can map the chambers, date the bones, and measure the acoustics, but the reason it exists and why it was shaped the way it was is still an open problem. And that part, archaeologists keep circling back to. The mystery of Varna gold. In 1972, a backhoe operator near Bulgaria's Black Sea coast hit something shiny in the dirt. He thought it was trash, probably a bottle cap or a piece of metal. But when he leaned in, what caused the light wasn't junk. It was gold jewelry. He pocketed a few pieces and went home, completely unaware he'd just broken into one of the oldest known graves in Europe. When archaeologists examined the site, what they uncovered completely rewrote just about everything we thought we knew about how early European societies worked. Beneath the soil was a cemetery with more than 280 graves, dated to roughly 4600 to 4200 BC. These people lived thousands of years before pyramids, writing, or formal states. Yet some of them were buried with staggering amounts of gold. And not the symbolic gold, real wealth, heavy jewelry, finely worked tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects made from what is now the oldest known processed gold in the world. Before Varna, early European farming societies were usually described as small, cooperative, and mostly equal. Varna destroyed that idea. It showed that inequality already existed back then, and it was extreme. Status, power, and wealth were being carefully tracked and displayed long before kings or empires showed up to formalize the process. So much for the good old days. Turns out they weren't that good unless you had gold. Only 4 of the graves held the bulk of the wealth, and each one of them was laid out with a kind of deliberate care that hinted at power and control. What's odd is that there are no signs of fortifications, mass violence, or large-scale warfare. No palaces either. Whoever these people were, they had somehow managed to build a social order without cities or writing. Yet they still understood who ruled and who followed. One grave even held a gold sheath over the man's private bits, which tells you exactly how seriously they took status. Or maybe this guy just really wanted to make sure his legacy was protected. Then, around 4000 BC, it all stopped. The settlement was abandoned, and the culture that had mastered gold vanished without warning. Archaeologists have tried to blame climate change, disease, or invasion, but none of those theories quite fit. Tier 3. Where are the Anasazi? If you ever visit Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado and look up at the cliffs, you'll see homes built into the rocks. These cliff dwellings are what remain of the Anasazi, the ancestor of today's Pueblo peoples. The Navajo call them ancient enemies, but archaeology and oral history show they were the same people who later became the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo communities. For centuries, the Anasazi lived across the plateaus and canyons of the American Southwest, building stone cities that still look like something out of an architect's late-night fantasy. From Mesa Verde to Chaco Canyon, their settlements were carefully planned, with road systems that ran for miles, walls aligned with the stars, and rooms that caught sunlight at just the right time of year. The Anasazi were farmers, astronomers, and builders who turned some of the harshest land in North America into organized civilization. Then, sometime in the late 1200s, they just disappeared. That's the mystery, or at least the first half of it. So what could make an entire culture walk away from the cities they spent centuries perfecting? The most common explanation is drought. Data obtained from tree rings at the site show years of brutal dryness around that time, so food would have run short, and water even shorter. But drought doesn't explain why it all happened so fast. Many of their sites looked like everyone dropped what they were doing and left mid-project. Half-built walls were never finished, and tools were abandoned on the floors. These patterns suggest that the Anasazi left in a hurry, but the settlements themselves stayed mostly intact. Then there's the evidence no one likes to talk about: bones. Excavations at some sites uncovered human remains with crushed skulls, broken limbs, and marks that suggest butchery. Some bones had even been cooked, which points to the uncomfortable fact that cannibalism may have entered the mix somehow. Whether that was a last resort during starvation or part of a violent ritual is still up for debate. But either way, it's easy to see that something went very wrong. As resources ran short, trust vanished too, and paranoia crept in. Around this same period, people started building their homes high on cliffs, far from open ground. That was never a good sign. Now here's where it gets even more complicated. The Anasazi didn't just vanish into thin air. Modern Pueblo peoples like the Hopi and Zuni say their ancestors simply moved on, migrating south and east to find new homes. Their oral histories described it as a transition, part of a greater cycle between worlds, not a collapse. Archaeologists actually support this version. The pottery styles, building patterns, and even genetic evidence show a clear connection between the ancient Anasazi and the Pueblo peoples today. Whatever drove the Anasazi to leave, evidence suggests it was serious enough to make them abandon cities they had spent generations building. Drought, scarcity, and social strain may have played a role, but there's little sign of collapse or mass death. At the end of the day, the big question is why a society so established chose to relocate so quickly. The Lost Roman Legion in Liqian. You're a Chinese official in a dusty frontier town, watching soldiers drill in a way you've never seen before. They lock shields, advance as one, and move with a discipline that feels out of place. No one knows who trained them or where they learned it. All you know is that they don't fight like anyone else you've come across. One of history's strangest mysteries starts with a group of Roman soldiers who may have ended up thousands of miles from home in China. According to some historians, after the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, when the Romans got absolutely destroyed by the Parthians, a few thousand captured soldiers were forced to fight for their captors in later battles. Somewhere along the war, they might have wandered east and vanished. Fast forward a few centuries, and ancient Chinese records mention a strange foreign army that fought with fish-scale formations, which sounds suspiciously like the Roman Tetsudo. That's the shield wall thing that makes them look like a walking turtle and terrified anyone still using swords like amateurs. These strange weapon-wielding foreigners reportedly settled in a small frontier town called Liqian, tucked in the Gansu province near the Silk Road. And over time, the name Liqian even became linked to Rome in some ancient texts. Then came the weird part. Early explorers noted that some Liqian locals had lighter hair, blue eyes, and more European features compared to nearby populations. The resemblance was enough to kick off a century of wild theories that Liqian was home to the descendants of those lost legionnaires. DNA testing in the 2000s tried to clear things up, but mostly made it worse. Some samples showed traces of European ancestry, others didn't, and scientists were left arguing because they didn't know what to make of it. Most historians today think it's just a coincidence. Liqian sat right on the Silk Road, the ancient world's busiest highway, so people from all over Eurasia passed through, traded, married, and moved on. That mix could easily explain the Roman traits without dragging a whole lost legion into the mix. Still, the theory refuses to die. Between the odd fighting tactics, strange artifacts, and a town's suspiciously Western-sounding name, people can't help but wonder. Maybe those soldiers didn't disappear after all. Maybe they just took the longest wrong turn in history and decided to retire in China. The lost mine of Ophir. Have you ever fantasized about finding a place where money is basically lying around waiting to be picked up? Yeah, so has everyone else. Kings did it, sailors did it, priests wrote sermons about it, and con artists made careers out of the idea. But in history, only a few people ever claimed they actually found that kind of place. And when they were asked where all that wealth came from, they gave the same answer every time: Ophir. According to the Bible, somewhere between Africa and Arabia, there was a land so rich it bankrolled King Solomon himself. Scripture says his ships returned every 3 years loaded with gold, ivory, and exotic animals. The kind of haul that turns a ruler into a legend. The problem is that no one can agree on where Ophir actually was. For centuries, it's been dragged across maps, shifted from coast to coast, and chased like a mirage that never stays put. Early explorers were sure they'd found it in Africa. Zimbabwe's massive stone ruins and traces of gold matched the old stories a little too well, so everyone jumped on the idea. By the 1500s, the Portuguese were combing the East African coast, convinced Solomon's mines had to be somewhere near Sofala. For a while, every clue seemed to point in the right direction, until it didn't. Part of the confusion comes from the source. The Book of Kings says Solomon's ships sailed to Ophir alongside those of Hiram of Tyre, and returned overflowing with riches. But it never says which sea they used. Was it the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, or some other route? Every translation sends explorers in a different direction, and every expedition ends with more questions than answers. Modern archaeologists have tried to cut through the legend. Some researchers now believe Ophir wasn't a single mine or city. It may have been a trade network where gold, incense, and gossip changed hands between Africa, Arabia, and India. Excavations across the Arabian Peninsula have turned up old smelting sites that hint at something like that. Yet the name Ophir itself has never shown up on any ancient map or tablet. It's like the name was invented to give greed a destination. Then, in 2010, a broken pot fragment near Tel Aviv surfaced. It carried early Hebrew script, referencing gold offerings for Solomon's temple. It wasn't proof of Ophir, but it reminded scholars that the legend might have roots in real trade networks. And suddenly, the old arguments flared back to life. Every time a fragment like this appears, it pulls historians into the same puzzle, separating fact from story, and trying to figure out whether Ophir was a place, a network, or something else entirely. The Queen of Sheba. This ancient mystery starts with one blink and you'll miss it scene in the Bible, where a mysterious queen shows up to visit King Solomon of Israel, carrying gold, spices, and a handful of riddles to test his wisdom. He answers every question. She showers him with gifts, and then she heads home. That's the entire story. Barely a paragraph long. Yet somehow, that short exchange snowballed into one of the most confusing legends in human history. Over the next few thousand years, 3 religions and 2 continents would all claim her as their own, each rewriting her story to fit their needs. In Jewish tradition, she was called Malkat Saba. In Islamic stories, she became Bilqis. And in Ethiopian Christianity, she turned into Makeda. Archaeologists say her supposed kingdom, Sheba, was in what is now Yemen. The Sabaeans who lived there were wealthy from incense and trade, and they did have queens. Inscriptions prove that much, but none mention her. There's no record of Bilqis, Makeda, or Queen of Sheba. Nothing in the ruins of Marib, their capital, even suggests that she was real. Jewish tradition took the original Bible paragraph and ran wild with it. Some rabbis said she wasn't even a person, just a metaphor for the wealthy kingdom of Sheba. Others turned her into a real queen who was clever, proud, and just curious enough to test Solomon's legendary wisdom. A later text, the Targum Sheni, gave the story its most theatrical version. In this one, Solomon sends a bird with a letter demanding her visit, and she arrives with 6,000 servants dressed alike. When she steps onto his glass floor, thinking it's water, she lifts her dress, and he spots her hairy legs. For some reason, every storyteller since has treated this like the most important part of the plot, but I digress. Later accounts accuse Solomon of sleeping with the queen and producing descendants that would later destroy his temple. Talk about the enemy within. Ethiopian Christianity flipped the whole thing on its head. In the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century epic, the Queen of Sheba became Makeda, the father of Menelik I, Solomon's son, and founder of Ethiopia's royal dynasty. That story gave Ethiopia its divine origin and tied its kings to the line of David. According to the same text, Menelik later stole the Ark of the Covenant and brought it to Ethiopia, where many still believe it remains today. All that from a brief cameo in the Bible. Islamic tradition gave her another rewrite. This time she's known as Bilqis, though the Quran never names her directly. It only describes a woman ruling the Sabaeans. She worshipped the sun until Solomon's message reached her through a hoopoe bird. She tested him, recognized his wisdom, and converted to worshipping one god. In this version, she isn't mocked or exoticized. She's respected for being intelligent, fair, and spiritually aware. The deeper you get into the Queen of Sheba's identity, the easier it'll be for you to see that the mystery isn't just whether she existed or not. It's how a figure described so briefly could absorb so many meanings, with almost no fixed details. She became a space others filled in, shaped by theology, politics, and identity. What survives is a reflection of the cultures that needed her to be something specific. Tier 4. The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, archaeologists digging near the village of Kujut Rabu, just outside of Baghdad, came across a small but puzzling object. The site itself dates back to the Parthian period, somewhere between 250 BC and 224 AD. Buried in the ground was a clay pot about 14 centimeters tall, containing a copper tube, an iron rod running through the center, and an asphalt stopper sealing the top. It didn't resemble any known vessel used for storage, cooking, or anything people usually buried on purpose, which is why it drew attention. In 1938, Wilhelm König, a German archaeologist and director of the National Museum of Iraq, published a paper proposing that the object could function as a simple galvanic cell. If filled with an acidic liquid, the copper and iron could produce a small electrical charge. König thought it might have been used for electroplating, maybe to coat silver with gold. It was a clever idea, but it immediately raised problems. The biggest issue is context. There are no wires, no tools, no workshops, and no written sources from the period describing anything like electrical work. No Parthian objects have been clearly identified as electroplated using this method. You can recreate the setup today and get a small voltage, but that only shows it can work in theory, not that it ever did in practice. That's where the more speculative ideas crept in. Some suggested it was used in religious rituals to give small shocks and make statues seem alive. Others argued it was never a battery at all, just a container for scrolls or ritual materials, with the metal parts serving some other purpose we no longer recognize. These ideas gained attention largely because they filled gaps left by the lack of context, not because they were supported by archaeological proof. What keeps the debate alive is not what the object can theoretically do, but how isolated it is. There are no parallel devices, no repeated designs, and no surrounding material culture that points clearly in one direction. As a result, most scholars treat the battery interpretation as an interesting possibility rather than a demonstrated fact. The object itself disappeared after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, when the National Museum was looted. Without it, further testing stopped, so the argument never really moved forward. What's left isn't proof of ancient electricity, and it isn't a solved misunderstanding either. It's a single object that raised a reasonable question, and then vanished before anyone could finish arguing about it. The Longyou Caves. In 1992, 4 farmers in Longyou County, Zhejiang Province decided to drain a few ponds that had been sitting in their village for as long as anyone could remember. They figured they could use the land for farming, but when the water finally cleared, they didn't find muddy pond beds. Instead, they came face to face with massive stone chambers carved by human hands. That discovery turned out to be one of the biggest archaeological mysteries in China. Soon, more of these chambers were uncovered nearby. By the time they were done counting, there were 24 of them. Every single one was man-made, surprisingly large, and estimated to be more than 2,000 years old. Each cave stands about 30 meters high, and together they cover roughly 30,000 square meters. You could hide a small village in there if you wanted to. Inside, you'll find carved stone rooms, bridges, gutters, and even pools. The ceilings are held up by stone pillars arranged with almost mathematical accuracy, and every surface is covered in the same neat pattern of chisel marks. But here's the creepy part. No one knows for sure who made them, when they were carved, or what purpose they served. There are no records, no mentions in local history, just nothing. For a project of that scale, that would have required thousands of workers and years of labor. You'd expect at least one emperor bragging about it on a tablet somewhere, but there's complete silence. Over the years, theories have piled up. Some say the caves were underground storage units. Others think they were Taoist sanctuaries, royal tombs, or maybe even a hidden palace. The problem is, none of those guesses match the evidence. If they were palaces, where are the artifacts? If they were mines, where are the tools? And if they were ceremonial halls, why does nobody mention them? That's the mystery here. The Longyou Caves represent an enormous coordinated effort carved deep into solid rock, and yet they exist in near total historical silence. The Pyramids of Argolis. If you drive through the quiet plains of Argolis in Greece without paying close attention, you might miss it. A small gray structure squatting by the roadside, with its sides leaning in just enough to look like it's trying to be a pyramid. Locals call it the Pyramid of Ħal-Saflieni. It's not large, polished, or even that pyramid-like, yet it has managed to confuse scholars for more than a century, which is impressive for something barely taller than a two-story house. The earliest written mention comes from Pausanias, a Greek geographer from the 2nd century AD who claimed it was a tomb for soldiers who killed each other in a fight over the throne of Argos. Problem is, that's the only version we've got. No other ancient texts call it a pyramid or even bother to mention it. Everything else that's been written since is just layers of guesswork dressed up as research. When archaeologists started digging in the early 1900s, they found pottery, broken stones, and a jumble of artifacts from completely different time periods, which made dating the structure a nightmare. Some fragments went as far back as 2800 BC, while others looked straight out of the Roman era. The layers were all mixed up, thanks to earlier excavations, time, and the occasional careless hand. So stratigraphy, the science of reading soil layers, was about as useful as a blindfolded map reader. Still, the debates didn't stop. In the 1990s, physicist Ioannis Liritzis used a new method called thermoluminescence dating, which basically measures how long minerals have been sitting in the dark away from sunlight. His results suggested the pyramid was built somewhere between 2500 and 2000 BC, roughly the same time as Egypt's oldest pyramids. You can imagine the chaos that followed. Egypt had the monopoly on ancient triangles, and suddenly Greece wanted a seat at the table. A classicist by the name of Mary Lefkowitz wasn't having it. She argued that the stones Liritzis tested might have been reused from older buildings, which would throw off his results completely. She also accused him of trying to prove Greece had pyramids older than Egypt's. Liritzis shot back, saying she didn't understand the science. In the end, everyone yelled, everyone wrote papers, and nobody agreed on anything, which is pretty standard procedure in archaeology when pride gets involved. By 2017, the Greek Ministry of Culture stepped in and tried to shut the whole thing down. They issued a carefully worded statement calling the structure a small fort, not a pyramid, and dated it to around the 4th century BC. According to the official line, it likely served as a roadside watchpost. Case closed, at least on paper. But outside of official archaeology, the argument never really stopped. The structure is still labeled a pyramid in guidebooks, debated in academic circles, and passed around online as evidence of something older or overlooked. The ministry's ruling may have settled the classification, but it didn't erase the questions that started the fight in the first place. The hanging coffins of China. You're hiking through a narrow mountain pass in southern China when you notice something wedged into the cliff above you. At first, it looks like debris. Then your eyes adjust, and you realize it's a wooden box. Then another. Then another. Dozens of them. It takes a moment to register what you're actually seeing. They're coffins. All of them are suspended high above the ground, and there's no clear explanation for how anyone managed to put them there. Some sit on wooden beams barely thick enough to support their weight. Others are pushed deep into cracks in the stone, positioned so precisely that the cliff itself seems to be part of the design. Most cultures bury their dead in the ground, but in the mountains of southern China, some communities did the opposite. They sealed their dead inside wooden coffins and placed them on cliff faces, sometimes hundreds of meters above the valley floor. Locals call these coffins shunguan, which literally means hanging coffins. Many of the best-known examples are associated with the Bo people, a group recorded as living in the region until the Ming Dynasty. In 1573, Ming forces destroyed their settlements, and the Bo vanished from historical records. What remains are the coffins, left behind without written explanation. Why this was done is still unclear. Elevation may have been practical, keeping remains away from animals or floods, or symbolic, tied to beliefs about honor, ancestors, or spiritual closeness. Marco Polo briefly noted that the dead were placed where others cannot, which confirms the practice existed, but does little to explain its meaning. The custom also wasn't limited to one place or one time period. Hanging coffins appear across Sichuan, Yunnan, Fujian, Hubei, and Guangxi. Some date back more than 2,000 years. While others were placed during the Tang or Ming dynasties, archaeologists still argue about how they got there. Some say they were lowered from above. Others think scaffolding was used. And then there's the group that believes they were carried up by people who didn't care much for physics. You should know that none of these explanations fully account for how the practice was carried out so consistently across difficult terrain. Inside the coffins, the contents vary. Some hold the remains of a single individual, while others contain multiple burials, along with cloth fragments, pottery shards, or sand that likely accumulated over time. Over the centuries, many coffins have suffered from exposure, decay, and other forms of natural deterioration, leaving gaps that can't be filled. Looting has made things worse. Coffins have been broken up to take artifacts, sometimes hundreds of meters above the ground, and many sites still lack proper protection. Objects that could have explained how and why these burials were done are now gone for good. What's left today is less a spectacle and more a problem of preservation. The coffins remain, but the information they once held is slipping away faster than the cliffs can hold them. Tier 5. The Set Animal. In ancient Egypt, gods were easy to recognize. You had the falcon-headed Horus, the ibis-headed Thoth, and the crocodile-headed Sobek. Each one of them matched an animal you could spot along the Nile. But then there was Set. His head didn't belong to any creature anyone had ever seen, but the Egyptians called it the Shah. For thousands of years, artists kept drawing it the same way, with a long snout, squared ears, stiff tail, and a body that looked almost canine. Almost, but not quite. You'd think that by now, with all our scanners and zoology degrees, someone would have figured it out. But no one has, because nothing fits. Jackal? Wrong ears. Aardvark? Wrong snout. Antelope? Not even close. The tail alone is a problem. It's always straight up, forked like a tuning fork, or capped with a tuft. The ears are long, squared at the top, and wide where they shouldn't be. Some scholars think it could have been based on a real, now extinct animal, but nobody really knows. The first time the Shah shows up is around 3100 BCE, when it was carved on the ceremonial mace head of a king we call Scorpion II. Yes, that was his real title, and no, he didn't come with a stinger. Later, it appears on the royal seats of Seth Peribsen and Khasekhemwy, two early pharaohs who both identified with Set. Back then, Set wasn't the bad guy yet. He was the god of strength, storms, and protection, the muscle who defended the sun god Ra from the chaos serpent Apophis every night. In Egyptian writing, the Set animal was also used in hieroglyphs to mark words tied to chaos, violence, and suffering. It even appeared in the names of gods and kings. Priests even carried staffs topped with the Shah's head as a reminder that chaos could be controlled. Then came the cult of Osiris, and the script flipped. Set went from protector to murderer. Myths rewrote him as the jealous brother who killed Osiris and brought evil into the world. When foreign rulers like Hyksos identified their storm god with Set, his image darkened further. By later dynasties, Set became a name to avoid. Temples were defaced, statues smashed, and the Set animal that was once proudly carved on emblems vanished from art. The god of chaos was exiled, and the Shah disappeared with him. Today, Egyptologists still argue over what the Set animal was supposed to be. Whatever it was, it appeared in Egyptian art for over 2,000 years. That's unusual because the Egyptians were otherwise obsessed with realism. Their birds look like birds. Their crocodiles look like crocodiles. Their snakes like snakes. But this creature never followed those rules. Scholars think its symbolic power, tied to chaos and divine authority, seems to have mattered more than its appearance. Why it persisted for so long, and what finally ended its use is still a mystery. Apollonius of Tyana. You're standing in a crowded Roman town when people start arguing about a man who just passed through. One person swears he healed a stranger with a few words. Another says he predicted an earthquake days before it happened. Someone else insisted the man doesn't age and hasn't for decades. The man in question is Apollonius of Tyana. At the peak of his popularity, Apollonius traveled through Asia Minor, Egypt, Babylon, and even India. Almost everything we know about him comes from one book, The Life of Apollonius of Tyana, written by Philostratus around 220 CE, over a century after Apollonius was gone. The book was commissioned by a Roman empress who admired him, and though it's supposed to be a biography, it reads more like a gospel. It credits him with uncanny abilities, like disappearing from locked rooms, predicting plagues, or surviving execution, though the details are brief and often contradictory. After his death, people built temples for him and placed his statues beside those of gods. A Roman official even swore he saw visions of Apollonius during a battle. For centuries, philosophers used him as proof that wisdom could elevate a man to godhood. But as Christianity spread, Apollonius' legend started to look inconvenient. By the 4th century, Christian writers had recast him as a magician possessed by demons, or a pagan invention meant to compete with Christ. Then his temples were destroyed, his books vanished, and his name slipped quietly out of public memory. Today, historians can't even agree how much of Philostratus' account was based on real sources, since most of them are lost. For someone once treated like a god, Apollonius left no tomb, no verified relics, and only a handful of scattered followers. Ironically, the strongest evidence of his existence is the story of his disappearance and the careful erasure of his presence from history. The Pleiades. If you ever look up at the night sky and see a small bunch of bright stars huddled together, that's probably the Pleiades. The Greeks called them the Seven Sisters, except you'll count only 6. The 7th, Merope, seems to have gone missing. Almost every culture that watched the night sky noticed the same thing. The Greeks, the Japanese, the Maya, the Aboriginal Australians, and even the Dogon of West Africa all talked about 7 stars, then 6. Somehow, all these people, spread across time and continents, remembered a star that isn't there anymore. Greek myth says that Pleiades were daughters of Atlas, the titan condemned to hold up the sky, and Pleione, a sea nymph. Their names were Maya, Electra, Tegede, Alcyone, Seleno, Sterope, and Merope. After their father's punishment, the hunter Orion wouldn't stop chasing them, so Zeus turned them into stars. Even then, Orion kept following them across the heavens. Darker versions of the legend says the sisters were so grief-stricken, they deleted themselves and only became stars after dying. Merope, who happened to be the faint one, supposedly dimmed herself out of shame after marrying the mortal Sisyphus, who was doomed to push a boulder forever, and became the lost Pleiad, while her sisters caught the attention of gods like Zeus and Poseidon. Across the world, the same pattern keeps showing up. In Japan, the cluster is called Subaru. And yes, it's the same Subaru as the car, with 6 stars instead of 7. The Aztecs, Maori, Zuni, and Aboriginal Australians tell versions of the same story too, usually about 7 sisters or a mother with 6 daughters where one goes missing, falls away, or is taken. Astronomy offers one explanation, and logically speaking, it makes the most sense. The 7th star may be a variable shell star, meaning its brightness can change as gas and dust shift around it. Under darker skies with no light pollution and stronger night vision, it may have been easier to see consistently than it is for most people today. There's also the problem of human eyesight itself. Even now, some people can clearly make out 7 stars in the cluster, while others struggle to see more than 5. The Pleiades contains hundreds of stars, formed around the same time, and none have physically vanished within recorded history. From an astronomical standpoint, the cluster hasn't changed in a way that would explain a literal disappearance. What hasn't gone away is the shared observation. Cultures with no contact, no shared language, and no way to compare notes all describe the same imbalance. 7 named figures tied to a cluster where most people could only see 6. Whether the explanation lies in variable stars, eyesight, or something else entirely, the consistency of that memory is the real mystery. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.